The classroom was unusually tense that day. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating rows of desks filled with restless students. Mrs. Klein, the usually composed and sharp-eyed history teacher, paced back and forth at the front of the room, her voice carrying an edge that even the most distracted students couldn't ignore. It was the last class before lunch, and everyone's patience was wearing thin, including hers. Sitting near the back, Marcus Jones doodled in the margins of his notebook. He was a bright, charismatic 12-year-old with a knack for making his classmates laugh, but his energy often landed him in trouble. His classmates adored him, but teachers sometimes misunderstood his lightheartedness. Today, Marcus wasn't trying to be destructive. He was simply fidgeting. Mrs. Klein's lesson on the American Revolution had long since lost its spark, and his mind had drifted elsewhere. "Marcus," Mrs. Klein snapped, her voice slicing through the murmur of the room. Heads turned in unison. "Are you paying attention, or do you think you're above learning like everyone else here?" Her words had a bite to them, sharper than her usual reprimands. Caught off guard, Marcus looked up, his pencil freezing mid-doodle. "I was listening, Mrs. Klein," he said, his voice even, though a flicker of embarrassment crossed his face. Mrs. Klein wasn't having it. "Don't lie to me," she barked, walking toward his desk. "If you think you're too smart to pay attention, maybe you'd like to teach the class." Laughter rippled through the room, but it wasn't mean-spirited. It was the nervous chuckling of kids caught in the middle of tension they didn't fully understand. Marcus hesitated, unsure how to respond. His fingers tightened around his pencil. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Klein," he said finally, his tone soft but steady. He wasn't trying to provoke her, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he spoke that seemed to irritate her even more. Mrs. Klein's face hardened. "Sorry doesn't cut it," she said, her voice rising. "If you're going to waste everyone's time, you can leave my classroom." The energy in the room shifted. Marcus sat frozen for a moment, then stood, his chair scraping against the floor. As he started gathering his things, Mrs. Klein took a step closer, her frustration boiling over. "You think you can just do whatever you want, don't you?" she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Before anyone could process what was happening, Mrs. Klein reached out and swatted Marcus on the arm. Not hard, but enough to make a sharp sound that echoed through the stunned silence of the classroom. Every student froze, wide-eyed. Marcus stiffened, staring at her in disbelief. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Marcus' classmates looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Mrs. Klein, too, seemed momentarily stunned by her own actions, her face flushing red as she realized what she had done. But before she could say a word, Marcus spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "My dad's not going to like this," he said, staring her straight in the eye. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet certainty that sent a chill through the room. Mrs. Klein let out a shaky laugh, trying to brush it off. "Oh, and what's your dad going to do?" she asked, but her voice wavered. The confidence she usually wore so easily had cracked. Marcus' expression didn't change. He reached for his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and turned toward the door. Just before he walked out, he paused, glancing back at her. His eyes held hers for a long moment before he said, "You'll find out soon enough." The door closed behind him, leaving Mrs. Klein standing there, pale and silent. The classroom buzzed with whispered questions and exchanged glances, but nobody dared say a word aloud. A sense of unease hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Marcus's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he headed for the principal's office. He wasn't angry. He didn't have to be, because his dad wasn't just any dad. He was Mr. Jones, the principal of the school. And Marcus knew that by the end of the day, everything would change. As Marcus walked down the quiet hallway, the sound of his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor seemed louder than usual. He kept his head high, his heart beating a steady rhythm in his chest. He wasn't scared, not of Mrs. Klein, not of the fallout. If anything, he felt a quiet resolve growing inside him. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he knew his father would hear about what happened eventually. Better to rip off the Band-Aid now. Principal Jones wasn't just Marcus's dad. He was a figure of authority respected by students, parents, and staff alike. He was firm but fair, with an air of calm that could diffuse even the most heated situations. Growing up with him as a father had taught Marcus a lot about taking responsibility and standing up for himself, but it also meant he understood the weight of his dad's presence. When Principal Jones stepped into a room, people listened. Marcus couldn't imagine how Mrs. Klein would react once she realized exactly whose child she had just slapped. Meanwhile, back in the classroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Students exchanged hushed whispers, some glancing nervously at Mrs. Klein, who stood rooted in place, her face pale and her jaw set tight. She tried to compose herself, turning back to the whiteboard, but her hand trembled as she picked up the marker. She began writing, but the lines came out crooked, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Do you think he's really going to tell his dad?" a girl whispered to her friend in the front row. "He said his dad wouldn't like it," another student added. "But what's he gonna do? She's a teacher." "Yeah, but his dad's the principal," someone muttered from the back. Mrs. Klein's sharp glare cut through the chatter. "That's enough," she snapped. "Everyone back to work." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying her frustration. The students exchanged one last round of glances before burying their heads in their books, though it was clear no one was actually focusing on the assignment. Inside, Mrs. Klein's mind was racing. What had possessed her to lose control like that? She had dealt with unruly students before, kids who shouted, fought, even cursed at her. But something about Marcus had gotten under her skin in a way she couldn't explain. Was it his calmness? The way he'd stood his ground without raising his voice or showing any fear? The thought of what might happen next gnawed at her. She tried to tell herself it wasn't a big deal, that Marcus was just bluffing to save face. But the more she replayed the moment in her mind, the harder it was to convince herself. In the principal's office, Mr. Jones was reviewing reports on his computer when the door swung open. His secretary looked in, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Mr. Jones, Marcus is here to see you," she said carefully. He glanced up, surprised. Marcus rarely came to his office during the school day, and when he did, it was usually to grab lunch money or check in before heading to practice. Something about the look on the secretary's face made him pause. "Send him in," he said, leaning back in his chair. Marcus walked in, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a more serious expression. He set his backpack down by the door and stood there for a moment, as if deciding how to begin. "Hey, Dad," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Hey, son," Mr. Jones replied, watching him closely. "What's going on? You don't look like you're here for a quick chat." Marcus hesitated, then sat down across from his father's desk. "Something happened in class," he said, "with Mrs. Klein." Mr. Jones' expression didn't change, but his sharp eyes took in every detail of Marcus's posture and tone. "What kind of something?" he asked carefully. Marcus exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "She hit me. Not like super hard or anything, but it wasn't okay." For a moment, the room was completely silent. Mr. Jones' calm exterior didn't crack, but his hand tightened slightly on the pen he was holding. "She hit you," he repeated, his voice low. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation, a way of grounding himself in what he just heard. "Yeah," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I wasn't being destructive or anything. She got mad because I wasn't paying attention, and then she just snapped. I don't think she meant to, but it happened." Mr. Jones set the pen down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He didn't speak right away, weighing his words carefully. "Did anyone else see this?" he asked finally. "The whole class," Marcus said. "It was pretty quiet after it happened, though." Mr. Jones nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "You did the right thing." He paused, then added, "I'll take it from here." Marcus hesitated, searching his father's face. "You're not mad at me, right? I didn't do anything wrong." A small, reassuring smile crossed Mr. Jones's face, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course not," he said. "You handled this well. I'm proud of you." Marcus nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He stood up, grabbing his backpack. "Okay, should I head back to class?" "Not yet," Mr. Jones said. "You can wait in the library for now. I'll talk to Mrs. Klein and we'll go from there." As Marcus left the office, Mr. Jones leaned back in his chair again, his thoughts racing. He'd always prided himself on being level-headed, on approaching every situation with fairness and professionalism. But the idea of someone laying a hand on his child, even in a moment of frustration, stirred something deeper, a fierce protectiveness he rarely had to confront. He took a deep breath, then picked up the phone. It was time to get to the bottom of this. Mrs. Klein stared at the clock above the whiteboard, watching the second hand crawl forward. The lunch bell was just minutes away, but the room felt like a pressure cooker. She had tried to resume her lesson, but her voice wavered, and the students weren't paying attention. Every glance from the kids felt like an accusation, a silent acknowledgement that she had crossed a line. Her palms were clammy, and she gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself. What if Marcus had already gone to the principal? What if this spiraled into something bigger than she could control? She swallowed hard and tried to calm her racing thoughts. In all her years of teaching, she had never done anything like this. She prided herself on her discipline, her ability to handle even the most difficult students with grace. But today, something had cracked. Maybe it was the stress. Her personal life had been a mess lately, and she hadn't been sleeping well. Or maybe it was Marcus's quiet defiance, the way he looked at her like he wasn't afraid. She didn't even know what had triggered her, but now that it was done, there was no taking it back. The lunch bell finally rang, and the students bolted for the door. A few lingered, their eyes darting between her and the exit, as if they were waiting to see what she would do next. "Go on," she said, forcing her voice to sound steady. They hesitated a moment longer before sipping out, leaving her alone in the room. Mrs. Klein sunk into her chair and buried her face in her hands. What was she supposed to do now? Apologize? Wait and see if Marcus's father approached her? She felt a surge of panic at the thought of facing Principal Jones. He was calm and composed, but there was something intimidating about him. Everyone respected him, and she doubted he'd let this slide, not when it involved his son. In the principal's office, Mr. Jones sat in silence after his phone call. He had spoken briefly with the district's HR department, laying out the situation in broad strokes without naming names. They had assured him they'd handle it discreetly, but he knew this wouldn't stay quiet for long. Word traveled fast in schools, and once the parents of Marcus' classmates found out, it would only be a matter of time before he faced a flood of calls and emails. He tapped a pen against the desk, thinking. On one hand, he wanted to address this as the principal, calm, impartial, focused on the facts. On the other hand, this was his son. The image of Marcus standing in his office, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability, replayed in his mind. He clenched his jaw, pushing the personal emotions aside. He had to handle this professionally, but how? As he mulled it over, his office phone buzzed. It was his secretary. "Mr. Jones," she said, her voice hesitant. "Mrs. Klein is here to see you." He straightened in his chair. "Send her in." The door opened, and Mrs. Klein stepped inside, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. She closed the door behind her and stood there for a moment, clutching a folder to her chest. "Principal Jones," she began, her voice faltering slightly. I thought it was best to come to you directly." He gestured for her to sit. "Mrs. Klein," he said, his tone neutral, "I assume you know why I wanted to speak with you." She nodded, setting the folder on the desk but not opening it. "I do," she said, her voice quieter now. I want to start by saying I regret what happened. It was a mistake, and I take full responsibility." Mr. Jones leaned back, studying her carefully. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, "from your perspective." Mrs. Klein took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "Marcus wasn't paying attention in class," she began. "I called him out, and he responded in a way that felt dismissive. I got frustrated, and I lost my temper. I didn't mean to hit him. It was a reflex, but it happened, and I know it was wrong." Mr. Jones listened silently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded once. "Thank you for being honest," he said. "But I need to be clear. This is a serious issue. I'll need to conduct a formal investigation. I'll be notifying the district. In the meantime, you'll be placed on administrative leave." Mrs. Klein's face fell. She had expected consequences, but hearing it aloud made it real. "I understand," she said quietly. I hope you know this wasn't about Marcus. I didn't mean to hurt him." "It doesn't matter whether you meant to or not," Mr. Jones said firmly. "What matters is that it happened. And now I have to ensure this is handled properly, not just as a principal, but as a father." At that, Mrs. Klein looked down, guilt etched across her face. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. As she left the office, Mr. Jones sat back, his mind still racing. The hardest part of this job was balancing fairness with accountability, and this situation tested that balance in ways he hadn't anticipated. He knew he had to remain professional, but a part of him couldn't shake the anger bubbling beneath the surface. This wasn't just about a teacher and a student. It was about his son. And the more he thought about it, the more determined he became to ensure Marcus felt supported through this, no matter what. In the library, Marcus sat at a corner table, trying to focus on the book in front of him. But his mind kept wandering back to the classroom, to the look on Mrs. Klein's face when she hit him. It hadn't been anger, not really. It was something more complicated, something he didn't fully understand. "Hey," a voice said, pulling him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see his best friend Jaden, standing there with his lunch tray. "You good?" Marcus nodded, but his expression said otherwise. Jaden sat down across from him, lowering his voice. Everyone's talking about it, he said. What happened with Mrs. Klein? They're saying your dad's gonna fire her. Marcus frowned. I don't know, he said honestly. I told him what happened, but I don't know what he's gonna do. Jaden studied him for a moment. You think she meant it? Like, was she trying to hurt you? Marcus thought about it, then shook his head. I don't think so, he said. She just lost it. But that doesn't make it okay. Yeah, Jaden agreed, leaning back in his chair. Your dad's not gonna let this slide though. Everyone knows he doesn't mess around when it comes to stuff like this. Marcus nodded, but he didn't respond. Deep down, he trusted his dad to handle things. But a small part of him couldn't help wondering how this would change things. Not just for Mrs. Klein, but for him too. As the school day stretched into the afternoon, the tension lingered like a storm waiting to break. Word had spread quickly, and by now, it wasn't just the students whispering about what had happened between Marcus and Mrs. Klein. Teachers in the staff lounge exchanged quiet conversations over coffee, glancing toward the principal's office with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Parents in the pickup line were already messaging each other in group chats, their questions filling the air. Did you hear what happened in history class? What's the principal going to do? In his office, Mr. Jones sat at his desk, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had spent the better part of the afternoon reviewing Mrs. Klein's record. She was an experienced teacher, well-liked by many students and respected by most of her peers. There were no previous complaints against her, no signs of misconduct. But today's incident had changed everything. A teacher putting their hands on a student, his son, was not something he could ignore, no matter her history or reputation. He tapped his pen against the desk, the rhythmic sound doing little to quiet his thoughts. On one hand, he needed to ensure this was handled fairly. Mrs. Klein had admitted her mistake, and there was a chance she could learn and grow from it. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus sitting across from him earlier, his voice steady but his eyes carrying a weight no child should have to bear. The phone on his desk buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was the district superintendent. Mr. Jones took a deep breath before answering. This is Principal Jones. Good afternoon, the superintendent said. Her tone was calm but serious, a professional veneer that gave away little emotion. I've been briefed on the situation involving Mrs. Klein. I wanted to touch base with you personally before we proceed. I appreciate that, Mr. Jones replied, keeping his voice even. It's a difficult situation, but I want to ensure it's handled correctly. The superintendent paused for a moment, then said, given the circumstances, we'll need to schedule a meeting with Mrs. Klein, the union representative, and yourself. This will allow us to formally review the incident and determine the appropriate course of action. I understand, Mr. Jones said. When would you like to schedule the meeting? Tomorrow morning, she replied. I know this is personal for you, given Marcus's involvement, so if you feel it's necessary, we can have an assistant principal handle the meeting instead. The suggestion lingered in the air. Mr. Jones clenched his jaw, considering it. Stepping back might give the appearance of impartiality, but would also feel like turning his back on his son when he needed him most. No, he said finally, I'll handle it myself. Very well, the superintendent said. We'll expect a full report by the end of the week. He be updated. As the call ended, Mr. Jones leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. Tomorrow would be a pivotal day, but for now, there was still the rest of the afternoon to navigate. Meanwhile, Marcus sat quietly in the library, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had tried to focus on his homework, but every time he started to write, his mind wandered back to Mrs. Klein's face after it happened. She had looked shocked, almost as surprised as he was. He wondered if she felt bad about it now, or if she was just angry he had told his dad. The thought of her sitting alone in her classroom, worrying about what would happen next, filled him with a strange mix of emotions, hurt, confusion, and even a little bit of guilt. But no matter how conflicted he felt, he couldn't shake the belief that what she did was wrong. Jaden's voice broke through his thoughts. You okay, man? Marcus looked up to see his friend leaning against the edge of the table. Yeah, he said, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. They called Mrs. Klein to the office earlier, Jaden said. Everybody's saying she looked freaked out. You think your dad's gonna fire her? I don't know, Marcus admitted. He didn't really say what he's gonna do. Jaden sat down across from him, lowering his voice. You think she'll apologize? Marcus hesitated, unsure how to answer. Part of him wanted her to. An apology might make things feel less complicated, like it could fix the crack that had formed between them. But another part of him wasn't so sure. What if she didn't mean it? What if it was just something she said to save herself? As the boys talked, the sound of footsteps echoed through the library. Marcus turned to see his dad standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Marcus," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus nodded and stood, following his father into the hallway. The quiet tension between them was almost palpable as they walked side by side toward the office. When they reached the door, Mr. Jones paused, looking down at his son. "I wanted to let you know that we're taking this seriously," he said. "I've spoken with Mrs. Klein, and there will be a formal review tomorrow. I'll make sure you're kept in the loop." "Okay," Marcus said softly. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you think she's sorry?" Mr. Jones studied him for a moment, his expression softening. "I think she knows she made a mistake," he said carefully. "But whether she's truly sorry, that's something only she can answer." The response didn't fully satisfy Marcus, but he nodded anyway. As he returned to the library, his father watched him go, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over him. No matter how professionally he handled this, the personal stakes made everything feel heavier, harder to navigate. As the afternoon turned into evening, the school emptied out, but the tension didn't fade. Mrs. Klein sat alone at her desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. She had tried to start writing an apology letter to Marcus, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say that wouldn't sound hollow? How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? At home, Marcus sat on his bed, his thoughts still racing. He glanced at his phone, considering texting one of his classmates to see what they thought, but he decided against it. This wasn't something he wanted to dissect with rumors or opinions. This was between him, Mrs. Klein, and his dad. In his own office, Mr. Jones stayed late, preparing for the meeting tomorrow. He knew that no matter how this played out, someone would feel it wasn't enough, whether it was Mrs. Klein, the students, the parents, or even Marcus. And yet, the choice wasn't just about what was fair, it was about what was right. The following morning, the school seemed quieter than usual, the air thick with anticipation. Teachers whispered in the hallways, students gathered in tight clusters near lockers, and the tension seemed to ripple through every corner of the building. It was as if the entire school knew something big was about to happen, even if they didn't have all the details. In the principal's office, Mr. Jones sat at his desk, reviewing his notes for the meeting. He had gone over the incident in his mind countless times, trying to anticipate every possible outcome. Today wasn't just about addressing what happened. It was about setting a precedent, ensuring the school remained a safe space for every student, including his son. But no matter how prepared he felt, a knot of unease settled in his chest. Something about the situation still felt unresolved, like there was more beneath the surface. The knock on his door came sharply, cutting through his thoughts. He stood, smoothing his tie before opening it. Mrs. Klein entered, her face pale but composed, followed closely by a district HR representative and a union rep. They greeted one another with polite nods, but the atmosphere was heavy. Mrs. Klein avoided his gaze, clutching a folder as if it were a lifeline. "Let's begin," Mr. Jones said, gesturing to the conference table in the corner of the room. They all took their seats, the tension palpable as the meeting got underway. For the first few minutes, the conversation remained clinical. The HR rep outlined the district's policies, the union rep spoke to Mrs. Klein's rights, and Mr. Jones reiterated the importance of accountability. Mrs. Klein answered their questions carefully, her voice steady but laced with regret. She didn't shy away from admitting what had happened, but she framed it as an isolated incident, a momentary lapse in judgment. "I take full responsibility for my actions," she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It was a mistake, and I deeply regret it. I've never done anything like this before, and I can assure you it will never happen again." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like the meeting might proceed smoothly. But just as the HR rep began to outline next steps, the door to the office burst open. Everyone turned, startled, as a woman stormed in, her face a mix of anger and determination. She was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that demanded attention. Mr. Jones recognized her immediately. She was Karen Freeman, a prominent member of the school's parent-teacher association and the mother of one of Marcus's classmates. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "I need to speak with all of you. This can't wait." The HR rep frowned. "Mrs. Freeman, this is a closed meeting." "Closed or not, this concerns all of us," Karen interrupted, glaring at them. "I've heard about what happened with Mrs. Klein, but there's something else you need to know." Mrs. Klein stiffened in her chair, her eyes darting nervously to Karen. Mr. Jones felt his stomach tighten. "Mrs. Freeman," he said, keeping his tone calm but firm, If you have information relevant to this situation, you need to share it appropriately. This isn't the time. It is the time, Karen insisted, slapping a folder onto the table. Because this isn't just about Marcus. Mrs. Klein has a history, and I have the proof. The room fell into stunned silence. Mrs. Klein's face turned ashen, and her hands gripped the edge of the table. That's not true, she said quickly, her voice shaking. I've never. Karen cut her off. You think no one would find out? You think parents don't talk? I've heard from other families, other schools. You've had incidents before, ones that were swept under the rug because they didn't want the scandal. Mr. Jones' pulse quickened as he reached for the folder. Inside were emails, notes, and what appeared to be a formal complaint from a parent at another school where Mrs. Klein had taught years ago. The complaint alleged verbal intimidation and inappropriate behavior, though it seemed no disciplinary action had been taken at the time. Still, the implications were clear. This wasn't the first time her conduct had been called into question. These are unsubstantiated allegations, Mrs. Klein said, her voice rising. They were investigated and dismissed. They have nothing to do with this incident. Karen crossed her arms, dismissed or buried, because from where I'm standing, this looks like a pattern. The union rep leaned forward, her expression tense. Mrs. Freeman, unless you have documented evidence directly related to this incident, you're stepping into dangerous territory. Bringing up unverified claims isn't just inappropriate, it's defamatory. I'm not here to argue legalities, Karen shot back. I'm here because parents deserve to know who's teaching their kids. If the school won't hold Mrs. Klein accountable, the community will. The room erupted into overlapping voices, everyone speaking at once. Mr. Jones raised a hand, silencing them. His mind raced as he tried to process this new development. If the allegations were true, or even if they weren't but gained traction, they could escalate the situation far beyond the walls of the school. The community's trust in the administration, in him, could be at stake. Enough, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. He looked at Karen. I appreciate your concerns, but this is not the appropriate forum for these allegations. We are addressing the current incident, and any additional claims will be handled through proper channels. Karen hesitated, clearly frustrated, but she nodded stiffly. Fine, she said, but don't think this is the end of it. As she left the room, the tension in the air felt even thicker. Mrs. Klein sat rigid in her chair, her eyes darting between the folder and Mr. Jones. The HR rep exchanged a glance with the union rep, both of them looking uneasy. Let's take a short recess, Mr. Jones said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. As everyone filed out of the office, he remained seated, staring at the folder on the table. The stakes had just been raised. What had started as a personal conflict between a teacher and his son was now threatening to become a public scandal. And for the first time, Mr. Jones wasn't sure if he could keep control of the situation, or how far the fallout would reach.